I'm excited to have with me today Dr. Eric Schwitzgebel. He is a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, and he's written several books and dozens of articles on topics related to philosophy of mind and belief and consciousness. Eric, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So I took a philosophy of mind class last semester, and we started off, starting with Descartes and going through the historical figures, but we also talked about some modern work, and it was pretty much all you and Chalmers. So I did read some of your work, and I'm excited because it seems like speaking to an authority on the subject.
Well, thanks. I'm flattered. I mean, David Chalmers is completely amazing and the most influential philosopher of mind, working kind of under the age of 60, working today. So I'm honored to be in his company.
Yeah. So a lot of people are interested in philosophy, myself included, and many of the listeners of this podcast, but very few are crazy enough to pursue it full time. So I'd like to talk about that, how you first became interested in it, or if it was just a personality thing, at what point you decided to take it seriously and pursue a career in philosophy.
Yeah. So my parents were both professors. My dad was a professor of psychology at California Lutheran University, and my mom taught chemistry and math at Oxnard Community College. And so I kind of came from an academic family, and I always loved academic stuff, did very well in high school, and knew I wanted to be a professor from pretty early on. And then I went to college. I went to Stanford, and my plan was just take whatever classes interested me the most and kind of pay no attention to requirements and majors and all that. And then whatever I ended up taking the most of, I figure, well, that must be what I like. So I'll go to grad school in that. And so that's what happened. I basically took all kinds of classes, found myself taking more philosophy than anything else, although I took lots of things in many different departments. So that's how I ended up getting into it, more or less. And then, got my PhD at Berkeley and was lucky enough to get a tenure track job at UC Riverside straight out of graduate school.
So when you decided to pursue your PhD, you have to pick a topic, right? Like a specialty within philosophy.
In the US system, you can go to graduate school without really having settled on a specialty yet, and then you can discover what your specialty will be once you've done some coursework in graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to Berkeley interested in several things, including epistemology and philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. But I ended up really getting excited and working on my dissertation when I took a class in developmental psychology taught by Uri Gergely, which was so philosophical, right? I mean, I remember, as I remember the first day, he was saying things like, oh, so a baby's born, how does it tell where its body ends and the world begins? How does it distinguish what's, a person in its environment from what's merely an object? How did babies figure this out? Are they born with it? Do they develop it? If they develop it, how? Right. And I thought, this is so fascinating. This is so fast. This is back in '93, and very few philosophers knew any developmental psychology back then. It's become more mainstream in philosophy now. But I was excited by philosophy of science, and I thought, here's a science, developmental psychology, that philosophers are not really looking at. It's got all these rich philosophical issues in it, and that really ignited me. And then, although Gergely was just visiting there. He was an occasional visitor in the summers, teaching summer classes. To my great good fortune, Alison Gopnik was there as an associate professor full time, and she is an incredibly philosophical psychologist. And so she took me into her lab, and that got me started down the path of empirically oriented philosophy of mind and philosophy of science.
There's a great amount of overlap between philosophy and psychology. So that puts you in more of the experimental philosopher area, which is somewhat new, isn't it?
Right. So there's this new subdiscipline within philosophy called experimental philosophy. That was basically founded in the early 2000s by people coming out of Stephen Stitch's lab and Josh Knobe, who took philosophical thought experiments, the kind of core idea in the early 2000s here, and still what's really core to a lot of what gets called experimental philosophy, is that you take philosophical thought experiments and then you try them on ordinary people and see what they say, right? So there are lots of these wild philosophical thought experiments that we use, and philosophers will commonly say things like, well, based on this thought experiment, it's obvious that, or the ordinary person would say that, or everyone surely would agree that, right? And then, but very few people had really like tested those. I mean, those are ultimately empirical claims, you know, what people would claim or what people think. People before the early 2000s, with the exception of Arne Ness doing some work in the 60s on this, people before the 2000s didn't test this. So in experimental philosophy, the kind of central version of experimental philosophy involves seeing what people's reactions are to kind of ordinary philosophical puzzle cases, and then comparing them with what philosophers say, and then seeing what philosophical conclusions can you draw from this.
Yeah, I remember a somewhat recent paper just like that. It was looking at self-driving cars, well, people's thoughts on self-driving cars, and it was basically a series of trolley problems where it's like, should the car turn and hit one or hit five people, or no, turn and hit one person, or like keep going and hit five people. And the interesting thing is that like everyday people on average would say stuff like, it's better to kill an old person than kill a young person or something like that. But the group of philosophers they had said something like, you know, it's entirely unethical to discriminate based on age or something like that.
Right. Yeah, so that's really fascinating, because what philosophers kind of agree on sometimes is not necessarily what other people would say. And then that raises this question. Okay, so are the philosophers right and ordinary people wrong? Right. And how do you tell that, especially for ethical questions? It's especially tricky with ethical questions because some people think that ethics is or should be grounded in people's reasoned reactions to these kinds of cases and what ordinary people would say when faced with these kinds of cases. And other people think it's got to be grounded in something else. So you end up with these meta-philosophical issues. What is the nature of, if the philosophical so-called experts disagree about, you know, a question like what you said, like, you know, you shouldn't prefer to hit an old person over a young person, and what do we call it? If the experts on average say that and the ordinary people disagree, like, what does that expertise consist in? What's the source of that expertise? Why should we think of philosophers as being experts in that way? What does this tell us about the psychology of philosophy and the psychology of philosophers?
Right. It's interesting that most people, including myself, probably have this impulse of like, yeah, it'd be better to save someone who's, you know, not nearing the end of their life. I guess it's something about potential.
Yeah. It seems like one of these cases where there'd be a divided opinion between what you might think of as a deontological approach.
What does that mean?
And what you think of as a consequentialist approach. And this is how trolley problems are often framed, to put these in tension with each other. So a consequentialist approach will be an approach that says basically what you're doing when you're thinking about ethics is you're trying to figure out what would have the best consequences overall. And, you know, one motto is the greatest good for the greatest number. And a deontological approach is an approach that's based in the idea that there are certain rules that you shouldn't violate, or certain principles of fairness that you should adhere to, even when the consequences might not be so good.
Right. So if you're taking the consequentialist approach, you could have questions like, would you end world hunger for the sake of constantly torturing someone? And people might want to do that.
Right. So yeah, so these come apart when good consequences might come from doing something terrible and unfair to a small number of people. In the kind of classic trolley case of this is there's a runaway trolley. It's going to hit 5 people if you do nothing, and it will kill them. But you can stop the trolley. The only way to stop the trolley that you can see, and this is kind of a silly example, but this is how the example is set up. The only way to stop the trolley that you can see is to push this big guy with a heavy backpack right in front of the trolley. Right? Maybe you're a small, light person, right? So you can push this big guy with a heavy backpack right in front of the trolley, and the trolley will grind to a halt on his body, killing him, but then saving the 5 people. So from a kind of straightforward consequentialist view, of course, it can always get complicated, and you can have consequentialists say different things, and deontologists say different things. But from the simplest kind of consequentialist view would say, well, look, basically, 1 person dies, 5 people get saved. The consequences are better if you push the guy with the heavy backpack. The deontologists would say, look, that's murder. You're killing somebody, right? Like, even if it's going to have good consequences, you shouldn't kill somebody like that. And people have divided intuitions about these kinds of cases. Philosophers have divided intuitions or divided judgments about these cases, and also ordinary people have divided opinions about these cases.
Yeah, it's a really interesting problem because you could keep upping the stakes. Like, even if someone says it's not right to murder for the sake of 5 lives, what if it's like 5 million? And then it's harder to sound like the morally virtuous one to keep defending that one life.
Sometimes deontologists will say, well, look, if there's enough at stake, right, you wouldn't kill 1 to save 5, but if it's 5 million, maybe. Deontologists can have kind of, as it were, different levels of purity about that.
Right. I remember some of your more empirical work was looking at like hypocrisy among moral philosophers.
Yeah. I wouldn't use the word hypocrisy. And we could talk about what my view of hypocrisy is and how it relates to this stuff if you want. But yeah, I've done a lot of work on the moral behavior of ethics professors. So this is whereas most experimental philosophy, including some of my own, looks at ordinary people's reactions to philosophical puzzle cases, what I've done in experimental philosophy has been pretty different from what most other philosophers have done. And one of the main projects I've done is looking at the actual real world moral behavior of ethics professors, philosophers who specialize in ethics. And I've done a whole bunch of studies of this. I think I've looked at 19 maybe different measures of moral behavior. And basically across all of the measures, with a couple small exceptions, I've seen no difference between the moral behavior of professional ethicists and the moral behavior of comparison groups, where the comparison group would either be other philosophers who don't specialize in ethics or professors from departments other than philosophy. And these are the right comparison groups because you want to match people in terms of age and education level and income and social status and all that kind of thing. So you want to compare the behavior of professors with other professors.
But the ethics professors had stronger opinions on the things you were measuring. So like don't litter or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things that I found was that although the ethicists didn't on average behave any differently from others, they did tend to have stronger moral opinions. They were more likely to say that various things were morally good or morally bad, and less likely to say that they're morally neutral. The kind of the clearest and starkest example of this has to do with the ethics of eating meat. So we could go through the details of that if you want.
Sure, because I'm mostly interested in why that wouldn't be hypocrisy. So hearing your sides for both of those.
All right, yeah. So I'll lay out the empirical data and then I'll talk about hypocrisy. So what we did was, this is collaboratively with Josh Rust, with whom I've done most of the work on ethics professors collaboratively. So what we did was we sent out questionnaires to about 1,000 professors in 5 US states. We got responses from about 60% of them, which is a very good response rate for a questionnaire survey. We bugged them by email and by paper mail into the mailboxes and that kind of stuff.
It would have been unethical for them not to respond.
Well, probably not. Well, we could get into that. There's a condition where there was one condition of that study is that half of the participants got $10 donated to a charity if they did respond,
Ooh.
and the other half did not.
Yeah.
Right? So you could, although I don't think it's unethical not to respond, arguably you could say it's ethically better to respond if the response also results in $10 going to charity.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, but anyway, we got 60% response rate, which I'm pretty pleased with from that study. And what we found was, so we had about 200 ethicists, about 200 professors of philosophy not specializing in ethics, and about 200 professors from other departments. And what we found, and the first part of the survey asked them their moral opinion about various ethical issues. And the second part of the survey asks for them to self-report their own behavior on those same issues. And then we also, unknown to the participants, had direct observational measures of some of their relevant behavior. Now, on the vegetarianism issue, we didn't have direct observational measures of their behavior, although we do have some measures of students who take philosophy, their behavior. We could talk about that later if you want. And in the questionnaire portion, most of our questions, we gave an example of a type of behavior, and then the response scale went from extremely morally bad to extremely morally good, a 9-point scale. So 1 was extremely morally bad, 9 was extremely morally good, and the midpoint 5 was morally neutral. Okay. So, and one of the prompts was regularly eating the meat of mammals such as beef or pork. So what we found there was that 60%, this is in 2009 in the United States, 60% of the professional ethicists rated it somewhere on the bad side of the scale, that is 1 to 4 on our 9-point scale. And 45% of the professors in philosophy who are not ethicists rated it as bad, and only 19% of the other professors rated it as bad. So we see this pretty big difference in expressed moral opinion, all the way from 60% for the ethicists to 19% for the non-philosophers.
Yeah.
And then later in the survey, we asked, at your last evening meal, not including snacks, did you eat the meat of a mammal? And there we found no statistically significant difference of opinion. If I'm recalling the numbers correctly, we had 38% of the people said yes, and it was 37% of the ethicists. So the ethicists were basically giving the same answers as the others. There was no statistically detectable difference among the groups in their response to the behavior question, despite the large difference in the response on the moral question. So, so here's an example of what you were saying. It seems like ethicists often, at least on several issues, have stronger moral opinions. They're more likely to say that this thing is good, this thing is bad, but their behavior seems to be about the same as others of similar social background.
Yeah, so if you're a psychologist, you'd call that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it might be a kind of cognitive dissonance. Yeah, so that's a one of the more striking results that we found. We didn't find that same result with all of our measures, but we did find that for some.
Were there any that the ethics professors were significantly behaving better on, like littering less or something like that?
Yeah, so we had 19 main measures. I think it was 19, maybe it was 17, anyway, something like that. And there were none of those on which the ethicists overall behaved statistically significantly better. There was one on which ethicists seemed to behave worse. That was being less likely to return library books. So what we did, we looked at the rates at which library books were missing from academic libraries. We looked specifically at books that were not very popular, right? So we'd be targeting mostly, hopefully, graduate students and professors, pretty obscure technical books. And the ethics books were more likely to be missing from the library than were comparable books in other areas of philosophy. So we found that was the one thing where we found maybe ethicists are behaving worse. The only thing where we found ethicists behaving better was one submeasure. So not one of our 19 main measures, but we did have one submeasure, which was we looked at rates of littering at the American Philosophical Association meetings, right? Leaving behind trash in your seat during these meetings, and some of these meetings can get kind of trashed, unfortunately. And we found that people in environmental ethics sessions were less likely to leave behind trash in their seat. So that was like the one kind of bright spot for ethicists in our results.
So you seem sympathetic to them in not really judging them for not behaving more morally based on their own convictions.
Right. I don't want to call it hypocrisy. So, right, I think hypocrisy involves kind of posing in front of others as though you engage in a certain kind of behavior, a certain kind of ethical behavior that you don't in fact engage in. And that's not the same thing as, say, having a value that you don't live up to. Unless you go and you say, yes, I'm a strict vegetarian, right? And then behind the scenes you're eating cheeseburgers. Right?
I see.
But our measure doesn't show that, right?
So the measure is more like my ideal self would be doing this.
Right. So, and here's one way to think about it. There are two ways in which you can get your behavior and your ideals aligned. One is to look at your behavior and then shape your ideals to match the behavior you already have. Right? So you might notice that you enjoy eating bacon double cheeseburgers. And so then when you're thinking about what your ideals are, you say, wow, that must not be ethical. That must not be unethical. That must be perfectly fine. And then you kind of come up with some story about why it's fine. Right? That would be rationalization. And those kinds of people, their ideals and their behavior perfectly match, but not for like an ethically admirable reason. That's just that they're rationalizing, right? So, and the other way you can get your ideals to match, of course, is that you discover that something maybe is morally good, you see your behavior doesn't match with it, and then you change your behavior to match your ideal, right? We're not seeing the ethicists do either of those, right? So they're not rationalizing. They're not tending to, the majority of them don't say, the majority of them eat meat, but the majority of them don't say that it's morally good to eat meat. So they're not engaged in that rationalization thing, right? At the same time, they're not shaping their behavior to match their ideals either. I do think there's a kind of integrity in that, right? I think there's a temptation to rationalize. Most people who eat meat want to come up with stories and justifications for why it's okay to do so. But maybe it's not okay. Right? We could talk about the specific level ethics of it if you want to, but the majority of ethicists think that that's actually morally better not to eat, especially factory farmed meat, if you're a typical resident of the United States. So let's just take that for granted. You could say the ethicists have the intellectual integrity to discover that fact and not sugarcoat it and not rationalize it away, even if they then don't have the follow-through in terms of shaping their own behavior, even if the majority don't have the follow-through of shaping their behavior to match that ideal.
Right, so they're holding themselves to this higher standard.
There's something admirable, I think, about holding yourself to demanding standards of ethics and then recognizing honestly that you fall short of them.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see if they have higher rates of stress or guilt or something like that, psychological measures.
Yes, I don't know how much this bleeds into their I mean, I'm partly an ethicist too, right? Everyday lives. But I do think one of the predictions of my general approach is that ethicists will feel slightly worse than others about the moral character of their behavior, because they'll tend to have demanding norms, and they'll tend to see that they're not living up to those norms. Whereas people who don't maybe engage in as much philosophical moral reflection might not feel that. They just eat the cheeseburger and feel fine about it, right? They don't feel that kind of guilt in the background.
Yeah. So this idea of having beliefs while simultaneously not living up to them, it seems related to your work on in-between beliefs, the idea that you can sort of hold beliefs while also either not having them 100% right, not being able to recall them all the time, or maybe changing your mind day to day about certain things.
Yes, right. Right. So I think of believing is not a matter of having a sentence stored in your head that when then someone asks you, what do you believe? You kind of retrieve that and then you say it.
Mhm.
There's a kind of cartoon model of believing that I think you see in some philosophy, and that also people can fall into, I think, in ordinary thinking sometimes, where belief is something like that, and on which, kind of, if you sincerely say something, then of course you believe it.
Mhm.
But I reject that model. I think that often we sincerely say things, and it's not quite the case that we believe the opposite. But it's also not quite right to say that we really believe it. And these are what I call cases of in-between believing.
Mhm.
So before we get to normative beliefs, ethical beliefs, let's talk about a belief. Like one common case I use is implicit bias.
Okay.
Right. So let's say you have someone who's conventional kind of member, political liberal, in the sense liberal is used in the United States, right? And they will say sincerely, all the races are intellectually equal, right? White people, black people, Asian people, Native Americans or American Indians, Pacific Islanders, everyone's equally intellectually capable. There's no racial differences in intelligence. They'll say that sincerely. They'll maybe have read some of the literature on it, so in some sense they know it to be true. And yet, right, maybe in their day-to-day life, they might not treat black people as their intellectual equals. Or if they're a professor, they might be surprised if say a black student makes a smart comment in class, whereas they wouldn't be surprised in the same way if a white or an Asian student made that comment. And maybe pervasively, they've got, or not always, right, but often enough, they've got this kind of bias, this tendency to see members of, say, black people in particular, as intellectually inferior, right? So now they'll sincerely say that all the races are intellectually equal, but they don't live that way, really, right? And you can imagine some black people, maybe some black students from this person's class, maybe behind the professor's back saying she doesn't really think that black people are that smart. And there's something right in that way of characterizing this prejudiced professor, say.
Uh-huh.
So that would be a case where I'd say it's not quite right to say that she believes black people are equally intelligent, but it's also not quite right to say that she believes the opposite, or that she completely fails to believe it, because she'll say it sincerely, and there's a sense in which she holds on to it.
I guess most people would attack this sincerely once they hear this scenario. That's what I feel inclined to do.
I mean, you could think that she's faking it, right? That in her heart she's saying, "Oh no, black people are stupid," right? But and that certainly under social pressure, people will say stuff like that, even if they don't mean it sincerely, in the sense that I'm using sincerely. But I'm imagining a case where it's not like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm imagining someone who is kind of intellectually convinced
Yeah.
that this is the case, and is not like having secret thoughts that they're not hiding and just feeling social pressure to say certain things.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's common enough. So that's the kind of case I have in mind.
Yeah.
I think of believing as something like having a personality trait, right? So think about what it is to be extroverted.
Mm-hmm.
To be extroverted is to, on average, to be disposed to say yes and be enthusiastic about going to parties, to like to meet new people, to enjoy hanging out in large groups, to be talkative in crowds. There's a bunch of kind of dispositions that are constitutive of being an extrovert. To be an extrovert is basically to live your life in a way that you kind of extroverts do. And that includes both your outward behavior, but also your inner reactions, right? An extrovert isn't like at the party outwardly seeming to have a good time, but inwardly they're like, oh, I wish I was home reading a book, right? That's not really an extrovert.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also have the emotional reactions, and you have the genuine pleasure in being in the parties. So having a belief like all the races are intellectually equal is like that, right? It's It's living your life that way. It's partly it's saying it sincerely, in my sense of sincerely here, right? And partly it's just how do you treat people?
Right.
How do you react with people, right? Do you treat people as intellectually equal regardless of their race, right? Do you have, what kinds of things are going on in the privacy of your own mind, right? What kinds of emotional reactions are you having? Are you feeling secret surprise if someone says something smart, and not surprised if someone else does, right? That whole pattern of living and reacting and acting and emotion, that's what it is to believe something. Believing something is living a certain way.
So do you think it's sort of like a slider scale of like 0 to 100, and 100 would be hypothetically you're imagining what it would mean to ultimately believe something and what it would mean to be like the perfect caricature of whatever that belief is?
Yes, right. And for big beliefs that are complicated and tangled up with our behavior and involve our values and self-conception, few people are 100% all the time, just like few people are 100% extrovert, right? So, one of the things that has kind of become now commonly believed about racism in the United States and probably most other places in the world, right, is that very few people are completely free of all tinges of racism, right? So you're not going to probably find many people who are 100% all the time completely believe all of these nice egalitarian things about the races. Right? But if it's close enough, then you can say, yeah, they believe. Just like if someone's close enough, you say, oh yeah, they're an extrovert, right? Maybe in certain moods they don't want to party. It's like, that's fine. You're still an extrovert, even if you're not like 100% all the time. Every single disposition is extroverted, right? So likewise, I'd say, with something like believing all the races are intellectually equal, right? Even if there are moments of where that slips a little bit, if that basically overall characterizes your posture toward the world, then you are accurately enough describable as being a believer in that.
What about when it's evenly split, or when you're
when
changing your mind day to day?
Yeah, that's when it's an in-between case, right? Like our prejudiced professor, right? She's got some dispositions that are in accord with it, and then other dispositions that are the opposite. And it's kind of like someone who's, say, extroverted on weekends and introverted on weekdays. It's not quite right to just say they're extroverted. It's not quite right to say they're introverted. It's kind of a more complicated story.
So it might take redefining the question. Like, what do you mean to believe?
Right. And in what ways? When you're asking, is this person extroverted, do you mean, are they going to be fun at the party? Yes. If you're asking whether they're extroverted, do you mean, is this a good person, to meet with clients, during the week? You might say, well, no. Right. So you specify a little more. Right. Does this person believe that all the races are intellectually equal? Well, we're assigning people for a debate team. This prejudiced professor would be great on the debate team. Of course, that's what she believes. That's the side she'll take. She knows the literature. Right. She'll defend it sincerely. She'd be great for that. Right. Does the professor believe that all the races are intellectually equal, and it's two black students talking to each other, outside of class? They're going to say something different because they're more interested in a different aspect of her overall dispositional profile.
Right. So in the example you gave, it was sincere, but it would be interesting to talk about people who fake beliefs. Because it does seem like that happens. Recently, I've been reading about this psychological phenomenon called virtue signaling. And the idea is, well, whether or not you believe something, you can sort of gain like these status points or moral superiority for claiming a certain popular belief, whether or not you actually believe it.
Yeah. I do think that can happen. I do think that can happen. I think we're not very good at knowing whether we believe things. So in contexts where there's a lot of social pressure to say something or to believe something, I think you'll often find it coming out of your mouth. And you won't have this, like, often. I mean, sometimes you will, right? But often you won't have this kind of telltale feeling of like, I'm lying, I'm faking it. It just comes out of your mouth because it seems like the right thing to say in the social context.
Yeah.
Right. And you might think you believe it. Maybe, but do you? Right? Would a different thing come out of your mouth in a different context? You might not really know. Do you live that way? You might not really know. I think it's hard to know for some of these beliefs, how we live and how we would answer these questions in different contexts. We kind of naturally tend to want to say things that gain social approval. And then we naturally tend to think that we believe the things that we say. And we naturally tend to think that we act according to the beliefs that we then attribute. But that can break down in lots of different ways.
So I'm seeing a common theme in your work and maybe in your personality generally, which is just this respect for the nuance of things and not wanting to take a side when things aren't so clear. And that leads us to crazyism, which is one of the your paper on crazyism was very interesting. So that's on philosophy of mind, and it seems like there's three major categories for like what the heck it means to be conscious, which is either like dualist, maybe we have a soul and it's immaterial, or some sort of material thing like whatever consciousness is in the brain, or panpsychist, which might say consciousness is everywhere. And you say that all three are crazy, which they kind of are.
Right. So I'm actually working on a book right now on all of this. So the thing I've been working on for 1.5 years on this book will finally hopefully bring a lot of my ideas on this together. But yeah, it's been scattered over several papers. But the basic idea here is that when it comes to the stream of conscious experience, consciousness, philosophers sometimes use the phrase what it's like, right? You know, there's something it's like to be you, there's something it's like to be a bat, there's nothing it's like to be a stone, presumably, unless you're a certain kind of panpsychist. Right, when it comes to that stream of experience that we all have, something that seems crazy has to be true. So I have a technical definition of what counts as a crazy position. So a position counts as crazy in my terminology. And I've thought about revising this terminology because it's maybe a little too negative, and there's this history of how the word crazy has been used. So one of the things I might do in the book is change the terms around a little bit. But let's stick with crazy because that's the terminology that I've used in the article you read.
Sure.
So this technical definition of a crazy position is a position that is radically contrary to common sense and for which we don't have compelling evidence. I mean, there's no compelling reason to believe it. So my claim is that with respect to consciousness, something that's crazy in the technical sense must be true. But we don't know which crazy thing is right.
Yeah.
And there are a bunch of options. And then the philosophical challenge and the philosophical project of that article and some of my other subsequent work in this book is to explore those options and show how there's lots of kind of options that you can't rule out in the sense that they're somewhat viable and there's not like a decisive winner. But all of those options really have some implications that are radically contrary to common sense. You can't kind of save common sense. No matter which path you go down, you're going to end up making some theoretical choices that land you in positions that ordinary people would think, that's bananas. Why would you think that? And this explains why, I think there's this historical fact. Every well-developed philosophical view in the history of all Earth that addresses these hard questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical or apparently physical world, every single view in all of history in every culture has been nuts. You cannot find one that fits common sense. I challenge you. I've been saying this now for like 10 years, and so far no one has said, oh, no, you missed this one. This one works. No, I feel pretty, I mean, it's a pretty bold generalization, and yet I feel pretty confident in it because it survived the test of time. If you look at any kind of view, there are wild implications for any answer to this question about how consciousness arises.
Yeah, I've gravitated towards panpsychism, which is in some sense the most crazy, because it says whatever consciousness is, it's fundamental, but it also
Yeah.
seems to avoid a major problem with the other two, which is like, if it's not always there, then when the heck does consciousness come into play? Like you mentioned
Yeah.
developmental psychology earlier. So if a baby's born and it's conscious, was it conscious in the womb? Even if the answer is yes, what about you keep going back and back, and either there has to be some point where it instantly becomes conscious out of nowhere, which doesn't make much sense, or well, actually, the panpsychist explanation that both the sperm and the egg are conscious, that sounds even crazier now that we're laying it out like this.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's my view. All the options are crazy, right? So, yeah, so panpsychism, the view that everything is conscious, or consciousness is literally everywhere, or almost everywhere, right? So a true panpsychist would say, like, even electrons are conscious, right? That's pretty contrary to, I think most people would agree, that's pretty contrary to common sense.
Yeah.
And yet it does have a certain kind of theoretical elegance to it. It avoids certain problems that other theories have. And so I do think that we should have it on our radar as a live possibility, because it's not like you avoid all problems and end up with a commonsensical view or a scientifically well-supported view by rejecting panpsychism in favor of something else, right? So if you look at, and one of the problems, and this is, just today, I put out a draft paper on borderline consciousness, as we were talking about before the recording started, which is developing some of these ideas earlier, right? But there's this, you talked about what I think of as the slippery slope argument for panpsychism, or another way of thinking about it is the quadrilemma of consciousness. Right.
So what's the fourth one?
There's, I think there are, when you're looking at, say, human development, or when you're looking across species, or when you're looking at evolutionary history, you're faced with a quadrilemma, 4 quadrilemmas, options, each of which has some strange implications. So we call these options horns, right? So there are 4 horns.
Okay.
So horn 1 is, let's do it for animals. Horn 1 is only human beings are conscious. Dogs don't have conscious experience. Apes don't have conscious experience, right? It might seem like your dog is feeling hungry, or can feel pain, or is excited, or has visual experiences or olfactory experiences, but nope, dogs are as empty as, toy robots or rocks or whatever, right? Zero conscious experience. It's all dark inside a dog, or not even dark, right? So that view I call human exceptionalism. The idea that only human beings have conscious experience. That's pretty also kind of unintuitive.
Doesn't work well with evolution.
Most people think that dogs are conscious. Most scientists think that dogs have conscious experience. Right. Option 2 would be panpsychism. Say everything is conscious. Every animal, every bacterium, every virus, every proton has conscious experience. Right. That's also, as we said, pretty crazy. So there are 2 other horns, right? Another one is that consciousness, this is what I call the saltation view, right? Is that consciousness appears somewhere suddenly, right? That's the idea that, like, say, okay, well, of course dogs are conscious, of course apes are conscious, right? Mice, pigeons, right? When you go far enough down, you'll find consciousness stops. And it stops suddenly, right? So you might say, okay, well, look, toads of this one species are conscious, but toads of this other very similar but slightly different species are not conscious, right? So you get the sudden saltation, right? There's a kind of continuum of physiological structure and a continuum of psychological abilities, but like somewhere, boom, consciousness winks in evolutionarily, right? And that's a little strange, right? Because you'd think if when consciousness arrives, there'd be like something would happen. You'd be able to tell, right? But you've got these organisms that would be very similar to each other and yet radically different in this way, that one would have conscious experiences and the other one almost exactly the same would lack them.
Uh-huh.
And then which organisms and how could you tell becomes this giant mess.
Yeah.
So then you've got the fourth option is to say, well, no, there are borderline cases, right? Organisms that are in some intermediate state, such that it's not quite right to say they're conscious, but it's also not quite right to say that they lack consciousness. Kind of like our in-between belief case, right?
Uh-huh.
Right. So this would be an organism about which you can't quite say there's something it's like to be that organism, and yet it's also not completely a blank.
Uh-huh.
That's actually the view that I tend to favor. That's what I've been arguing in this paper that I just released today. But I think it's pretty unintuitive.
Mm-hmm. How much of it do you think is a definitional issue? Because it doesn't seem like we have a universal definition of what consciousness even is. So that means that you could include or exclude different things based on different definitions.
Yeah, consciousness is hard to define. So I do have a paper where I define consciousness. It's hard to define because you can't define it analytically in terms of other things, because it's kind of its own fundamental concept.
That's that panpsychist claim, isn't it?
You don't have to be a panpsychist, I think, to believe that, although that certainly fits well with panpsychism. And it's also hard to define kind of functionally or in terms of its features, because those are highly contested among philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists who talk about consciousness.
Yeah.
So I think really the best way to define consciousness, and if you look at some of the best definitions by philosophers, they do tend to do this, although they're not always kind of fully explicit that they're doing this, is define it by example. So what do I mean by conscious? Well, what I mean is this kind of thing and not this other kind of thing, right? So we define things by example all the time. If I can define furniture by example. I can say, well, look, here are some examples of furniture: desks, dressers, tables, chairs. Here's some things that aren't furniture, right? Paintings, pens, pans, right? These are all household items. I give enough positive examples and enough negative examples, and eventually you get the idea of what furniture is, and you'd be like, and then a new example comes, footstool. And you're like, oh yeah, well, I can see that it's furniture because it's got that thing in common with the positive examples.
Yeah, this would be a good place to talk about functionalism, because you have your stereotypical chair or even a stool or whatever, but then you also have things that can count as a chair, like a bag full of beans or a tree stump or just like a big rock, anything you can sit on.
Yeah. Right. So when you're defining something by example in this way, and you don't have a rigorous analytic definition of it, you can end up with these cases that are kind of borderline and strange and vague, because that is one thing that happens with definition by example. I don't actually want my case for borderline cases of consciousness to turn on that exactly, but I think that is good for the general. But if that's true of consciousness, of the definition of consciousness, I think that's not bad for my view.
So did you lay out any examples of what something borderline conscious would be?
Let me give you. No, I didn't.
Okay.
I pointed towards zones where it might be found, but I don't have any examples, and there's a reason for that.
Okay.
Let me finish the definition by example of consciousness for the listeners who might be like still confused, which would be totally understandable. So so if you close your eyes and you think about, say, the best way to get to your friend's house on the other side of town during rush hour, right? Then you're thinking about something. You're having an experience of like trying to figure something out. That's kind of an example of a conscious experience. Or you open your eyes and Maybe you're looking at this video and you're looking at my orange shirt. You're having a visual conscious experience of orange. Or if you can remember, like feeling sudden fear if you're when you're about to be in a car accident, right? That's an emotional experience. Or if you pinch the back of your hand sharply, you can feel the pain. All those things, I think, have something kind of obvious in common. They're all conscious experiences, right? So consciousness refers to the obvious thing that all of those things I just referred to have in common. They're all experiences, they're all consciousness, they're all part of what it's like to be you, right? And there are other things that don't have that feature, right? Like the complex processes involved in early visual processing, or your memory that Obama was president of the United States in 2010, which say you weren't thinking about until just now, your memory a few minutes ago, right? Both of those things are mental in some sense, but they weren't part of your conscious experience a few minutes ago. So yeah, so that's that kind of thing, doing that carefully. And there are various risks and challenges. I have a whole paper where I try to go through the risks and challenges of definition by example, as well as its benefits. But that's what I mean by consciousness, those kinds of things. So I do think that there is kind of an obvious property that the positive examples share in common. And then the question is, do snails have that? Do frogs have that? Right? And I don't think that's a totally ambiguous question. I think it's possible that the answer is that it's a borderline case, just like, you know, a box that you're sitting on is a borderline case of furniture. It's possible that it's a borderline case. But I don't think it's like a radically unclear question. I think it's a question we can sink our teeth into and say, okay, yeah, that's a real question. I could see kind of how it could go either way.
Yeah, I've used the slippery slope arguments on my friends when talking about consciousness and, you know, just going down the ladder, like, are we conscious? Yes. Are apes? Yes. Are dogs? And then down to fish is where it gets a bit borderline. And then usually people still say fish are somewhat conscious. And then it's like, you know, how about a little amoeba or something like that? And we have no idea, but some of them, some of the clever ones will get around it by saying, even if it is using this train of thought, it loses its meaning in terms of talking about consciousness as you and I experience it. So it seems like that's related. So it's like if you follow the logical pathway, then borderline consciousness is definitely connected to our form of consciousness, but it's also so different that you start to ask, is it useful talking about it in the same category?
Yeah, I think that's very sensible to say, look, you know, our category of conscious might be fuzzy boundaried like this, and you got something that's kind of like far enough off into that fuzzy boundary, a different term might be better than conscious, than trying to like resolve whether it's conscious or not, right? So like go back to our belief case, right? So you could have a big debate about whether this implicit racist really believes or doesn't really believe that all the races are intellectually equal. Or you can kind of cut that short by saying, well, look, let's invent a new category, call it the implicit racist, right? And she's a very good example of that, right? So maybe we need a new category for, say, garden snails are my favorite example of an organism where people's opinions tend to split. Like almost everybody thinks that, you know, vertebrates are conscious, or at least most vertebrates. I mean, maybe there's some question about fish, but and few people will say that amoeba or bacteria or plants are conscious. And snails are nice. They're right kind of in the middle where people's opinions start spreading, I think, a little bit, especially once you learn a little bit about snails, because they're like, their neural systems are really simple. Well, not that simple, but they only have, like, their central nervous system has about 60,000 neurons. Right? There are 500 million neurons that line your intestines, right?
Wow.
And you can snip the connection between your gut brain, as it's called, right, and your the rest of your brain, and it'll still function, right? So you got like 500 million neurons in your stomach and intestines, right, and only 60,000 in a snail. right? That's way smaller even than, you know, bees and ants will have like 250,000.
Yeah.
And they don't even have really centralized brains. What they've got is like clumps of brain cells, ganglia, mostly in a ring around their esophagus. Right? So it's not even like fully centralized like a brain is. Right. So you might say, well, look, you know, when we're talking about borderline cases of something, whether it's a belief or being and experiencing entity, sometimes it's better just to come up with a new term instead of trying to jam it onto one side or the other of this distinction where it's hazy.
Yeah. So when you think about something like a snail navigating, I mean, just the fact that it can move around and navigate, that makes me want to say it's conscious. Other people, I'm guessing, might say something like, whatever it's doing, it's like purely instinctual. And so there's this idea of taking whatever is instinct or sort of more just like computational, because that's sort of what a computer does too. Like computers do these complex tasks that we don't consider conscious.
Right.
So again, I guess it seems to fall under whether your definition can include or exclude certain functions as part of conscious experience or not.
Right. So I wouldn't be inclined to make the function part of the definition. I want that to be substantive. Right. So here's how I think of it. Right. We've got a clear referent of consciousness. Right. It is the kind of thing that your visual experiences and your emotional experiences and your imagery and your pain all have in common. It's that kind of obvious property they have in common. Now, how that relates to the functions of a living organism, that's an open scientific question that you can't settle by definition. Now, maybe scientists will eventually settle it. I think we're pretty far from that. Right, but I don't rule it out in principle. Scientists might eventually settle what functions, you know, constitute or correlate with consciousness. But yeah, I wouldn't want to say by definition. But if you make it by definition, then you lose the interest and challenge of the question.
Yeah.
If you say so, like one example, one simple definition of consciousness is you can say, well, here's what I mean by conscious. By conscious, I just mean you can verbally report it. Right? You could. That's like a simple functional definition of consciousness. Right? Now, obviously, snails aren't conscious. In fact, monkeys aren't conscious. Apes aren't conscious. Dogs aren't conscious because they don't verbally report anything. Right?
Or we just can't understand them.
Maybe you could get an ape to verbally report something if you teach it language, right? But that'll be a stretch at best, right? So, but now it seems, but we've lost our question because it seems like there still is the substantive question, which is, no, I didn't mean like verbal report. I meant like this thing, right?
Yeah.
That I'm referring to, the thing that pains and visual experiences and all that have in common. What I know is, do they have that? I can't just kind of say that by definition equals verbal reportability, and then therefore they don't have that. That's that misses the question.
Okay, so what about this example? There might be a technical term for it. So imagine removing a neuron from your brain and just continually doing that until at some point you're no longer conscious, or maybe you keep doing it and you reach a borderline state.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, philosophers have done these kinds of thought experiments. I think that it's plausible that you could do some sort of simplification procedure where you would slowly lose consciousness. Removing one neuron at a time. You know, I think realistically, like you get in there and do the surgery, there might be a phase transition, right? So one of the things I think that makes this kind of gray area borderline view non-obvious is that people who want to say, hey, no, look, there's a sharp line, can appeal to the fact that there are in nature sometimes phase transitions. You know, like you decrease the temperature of water, decrease it, and then like at 0.0 degrees Celsius, it's ice. And that
Yeah.
happens pretty quickly, right? That's a phase transition. It changes from the liquid to the solid phase. That's not instantaneous, but it's pretty fast. So possibly, if you were to remove a neuron at a time from a human, right, they would, well, we have phase transitions. We know there are phase transitions in human consciousness because there's a big phase transition between sleeping and waking.
Right.
Right. That's pretty quick sometimes. I don't think it's a perfect phase transition. There are in-between states. And furthermore, when you're sleeping, often you're having conscious experiences like dreams. We don't ordinarily, often people will say when you're dreaming that you're not conscious, but that's not consciousness in the intended sense. Right? Because there's something, it's like there's an experience, there are experiences you have when you're dreaming. So they have that thing in common with visual experiences and imagery experiences. In fact, maybe dreams are kinds of sensory or imagery experiences. So, right. So there's phase transitions in the mind between, say, sleeping and waking. They aren't exactly the phase transition of between non-conscious and conscious, though. So that gets messy. But there are reasons to think that there are phase transitions in the brain, right? So it could be you remove one neuron at a time, and then suddenly there's a phase transition, the person suddenly becomes non-conscious. I wouldn't want to rule that out.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes me more comfortable with the idea that maybe that could emerge at a single point without it being like violating laws of nature.
Right. The thing is, you don't see that, and part of the reason that I like the animal case a little better is you don't see that with non-human animals, right? The equivalent of a phase transition for non-human animals would be, you imagine a series of animals of different levels of, say, cognitive sophistication, and then suddenly there's a big gap. Like, oh, all these ones over here have all these features in common, and there's a big gap, and then there's other ones that are, say, purely reflexive. Because when you have a phase transition, lots of properties change at once, right? When you transition, say, between sleeping and waking, suddenly you're remembering what's happening during the day, your EEG patterns change, right? Your eyes open, all these things change. You lay down memories much better, right? So there's a whole bunch of changes when you've got a phase transition. Or ice, from water to ice, right? You can drop a block of it on your toe and you'll bruise it. You can cut squares out of it. All kinds of things happen, right? So if there was a phase transition between in evolution, as it were, or across the phylogenetic spectrum, you would say, okay, well, here's where consciousness arrives. There's going to have to be all these other things that change at the same time that consciousness changes. That's what we don't see in animal cases. We don't see, like, oh, here's the reason it's between this kind of toad and this kind of, why this toad is conscious and this one's not, because this one's radically different. It's got all these things. It's got, non-reflex behaviors and complex learning and all that, and this one doesn't. Right? Then we'd say, oh, look, if there was that kind of gap, then there'd at least be a case for saying maybe consciousness tracks exactly with that gap.
Right.
So the slippery slope argument, I think, works a little better when we think about animal cases than when we think about removing brain cells.
So in the very loose sense of the word animal, if we're just talking about life, it seems like people, whether you're borderline on the snail or the amoeba or not, you're more likely to say that consciousness requires life, or maybe those two are somewhat the same thing. I mean, life is another one of those weird things where at the extreme borderline cases, we don't exactly have a great definition for when it emerges.
Yeah, that's right. One of the issues here is whether you could ever have consciousness in machines, right? So some conventional definitions of life, right, define life in terms of things like having an evolutionary history and reproduction and being made of organic molecules and those sorts of things. I mean, I'm not sure that a definition of life has to have all of those features. But if it does, it looks like a robot wouldn't be alive. Like if you imagine the C-3PO from Star Wars, right? He doesn't have an evolutionary history. He doesn't reproduce. In some sense, he's no more alive than a laptop computer is.
Right.
is it possible that a machine like that could ever be conscious? There's, of course, a huge amount of debate about this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm inclined to say yes, but it seems like most people would say no because it's a deterministic process. And if you make that argument, you're sort of implicitly making a claim that you believe that humans have free will or something special that makes our conscious experience more than just like a direct result of different neurons firing in certain ways.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that most scientists and philosophers think now, it's pretty close to consensus, but not a complete consensus, is that the human mind is, if not deterministic, if there's randomness, it's not different in principle, or failure of determinism. It's not different in principle from the kind of thing that you can see in other kinds of natural systems.
Mm-hmm.
There might be quantum randomness. Not everything might be deterministic in our minds.
Right.
But that's, if there's a gap between us and machines, it's probably not in we are undetermined in some radical way that machines could never be.
Mm-hmm. So I think the last question we can talk about is, aside from that it's fun to talk about, what's the point of all this discussion? I don't ask that question too often, but one of my friends did. So it seems like we're either going to come to an answer or never come to an answer. And well, it doesn't seem likely that we're going to come to an answer because we haven't already, and all the possibilities are crazy.
What's the point of it? Yeah. Look, I think that it is intrinsically valuable to think about this stuff and talk about this stuff and reason our way around through this stuff, even if we can't find an answer.
You mean for you because you enjoy it, or for humanity?
As soon as you say because I enjoy it, that makes it not even intrinsic anymore. I mean for humanity. I mean for me in particular, and you in particular, and for, I mean, look, here is something I think that is amazing about planet Earth. It's got these like bags of mostly water, right? You and me, right? And they can think about like these incredibly hard, complicated philosophical questions. And that's just like, that's one of the things that makes Earth such a wonderful, amazing, valuable planet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if there was some other planet far away that had, only plants and no animals, it would still be amazing and wonderful, but it would be missing something, right? Or if it had animals, but they're all kind of cow and deers and nobody could engage in philosophy, that would be a pretty amazing planet too, but it would be missing something, right? I think that it's actually among the fundamental goods of the universe that we think about this stuff. So, and there doesn't need to be a further reason. I mean, it makes us happy. I enjoy it, right? So that's like a bonus. But it's not like, oh, if I could be happy by pressing a button and just get rid of all this stuff, that would be as good. No. I mean, I don't object to being happy as a result of pressing a button, but there's something lost in getting rid of this stuff. So, we think about what are the intrinsically valuable things in the world, or what are the intrinsic goods in the world. I think one of them is happiness, but another one is knowledge, and another one is wonder, and another one is just the activation of our intellects on big questions.
So if we had all the answers, we wouldn't be able to ask those questions and to experience that.
In a way, we'd lose something. If there was a God who just handed us all the answers on a silver platter, and we couldn't wonder and argue about them anymore and think about them anymore, we'd just be like, look it up in a book. We'd have lost. I mean, we'd have gained something amazing, but we'd also have lost something really amazing.
That's a great point to end on. Eric, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Enjoyed this.